Good evening. Thank you for joining Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones for tonight's presentation. I'm Jessie Davis. I am the president of Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones. Our vision is to restore and sustain biodiversity through education and the practice of landscaping with native plants. For additional information regarding our chapter, please visit our website at kalamazoowild-ones.org. On the site, you will find informational tabs that will guide you towards our upcoming programs, resources to assist you in helping you find the right plant for the right space, and membership information should you wish to explore joining our growing family. Tonight's presentation is being recorded. You may rewatch at your leisure on our YouTube channel. Feel free to ask questions via the chat box as it will be monitored throughout the event. Please keep yourself muted, but if you need to ask a question, feel free to put it through the chat box and you may be called upon to maybe expand on your question. And with that, I will hand it over to Ann Frazier, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. And welcome everyone. We're pleased tonight to have with us Ashley Bennet, who is a research leader with the Electric Power Research Institute. And she's actually based in Knoxville, Tennessee. But she is a Midwesterner, born and bred, from what I understand. Yes. And you might be wondering, why are we talking about utility right-of-ways tonight? But this connects with native plants and pollinators because this is great habitat and has great potential for expanding our areas where we can support native plants and their pollinators. And a paper I was reading said the land area covered by Powerline easements in the United States exceeds the area of almost all national parks, including Yellowstone. So I was surprised to see that. Ashley is, as I mentioned, she's a research leader for EPRI, and she has a long history working in entomology. She did her master's at University of Illinois and then her PhD at University of Wisconsin. And she came to Michigan and did a postdoc with Rufus Isaac's lab at Michigan State University. And there she was focusing on biofuel crops and the interaction between those crops for supporting pollinators and habitat. So she's also had a stint as a assistant professor at New Mexico State University. And all this time, her research has been focused on integrated pest management as well as pollinator conservation. So she then brought those skills to EPRI, where she works to promote integrated vegetation management on Powerline utility right-of-ways, but also to work to find ways to conserve and support both native plants and not just pollinators, but other animals that benefit from this habitat, such as birds and bats. So tonight she is going to tell us about some of the research that her organization does. And we're very pleased to have her with us. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that wonderful introduction. So I just would love everyone to please ask questions as I'm going. Please feel free to interrupt me. I really don't want to be talking for 45 minutes straight, so it'll help break it up if you guys ask me questions. So as Anne said, I work for the Electric Power Research Institute, which is a nonprofit. And at EPRI, my focus is on vegetation management research and how I can help utilities do a better job of doing vegetation management on rights-of-way, solar sites, brownfields, substations, and we're also interested in improving not only integrated vegetation management strategies, but increasing conservation benefits. So let's see if I can't, the one thing we didn't practice is flipping through the slides. There we go. So just a quick overview, as Anne was mentioning, there are a lot of power line rights of way across the country. So this is a map that shows you where all the power lines are, and you can see the different voltages of these lines. And we have about 200,000 miles of power lines and natural gas lines in the United States. And collectively, they account for about 10 million acres of habitat. So the potential to utilize these rights of way for conservation purposes is quite large. And that's one of the reasons why I took this position, because I was very excited about the potential to get to work with these utilities and help them think about how they can do a better job of utilizing rights of way for conservation. So there's several different opportunities for conservation on rights of way. As Anne mentioned, we can think about native plants, we can think about pollinators, we can think about birds, and even bats. And from the utility perspective, they're very interested in thinking about how they can use vegetation management strategies to lower their costs. So they're having to go out and do a lot of vegetation management to reduce the trees and shrubs on right-of-ways to ensure that you guys are getting reliable delivery of power, as well as making sure there are also regulations. So if trees and shrubs get too high, utilities are subject to fines. So they're really wanting to make sure that that vegetation stays at a right height on their utility rights of way. So I am going to be telling you about 3 different projects this evening, all looking at different ways to manage vegetation on rights of way. And the first project I'm going to tell you about is a study I'm doing with the Southern Company and Auburn University. And this project is located in the state of Alabama. The goals for this project were to implement different IVM treatments on some of their rights of way in Alabama. And we wanted to measure the impact these different IVM treatments had on plants and pollinators. We wanted to track costs of these different vegetation management practices. And then at the end of the study, we hopefully wanted to have some best management practices that the utilities could implement going forward on their rights of way. And this was actually a 4-year study. So as I said, this project is in the state of Alabama. And whenever I use my mouse, can you actually see my mouse on your screen or not? No? You can. Okay.
Yes.
So you can see, so I'll try to use my mouse as a pointer whenever I'm wanting to highlight something. So you can see we have 4 different dots on this map, and those are locations of the rights of way that we are doing research. And the red star is where Auburn University is located. And Auburn was our on-the-ground partner going out and doing the vegetation and pollinator sampling on these rights of way. So to give you a little more background on the study design that we're using for this project, as I mentioned, we have 4 different rights of way that we are going out and sampling. And then within each right of way, which I'm going to call a block, we established 3 different IVM treatments. And so these green rectangles represent the different IVM treatments that we established in each of the 4 rights of way or study blocks. And each of these sections of right-of-way was about 1 mile. And when we were selecting these study sites, we wanted to try to have, okay, what does IVM stand for? Integrated Vegetation Management. That's a really good question. So anytime I use an acronym that you're not familiar with, please stop and ask me. So Integrated Vegetation Management, for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, is very similar to Integrated Pest Management if you are familiar with that term. So it's different strategies using cultural controls, biological controls, mechanical and physical controls, as well as biological controls to manage pests. And in this case, our pests are trees and shrubs that are growing too tall. So the utility is going in and using, for the most part, mechanical and chemical controls to try to manage that vegetation. Are there any other questions that I've said or I've gone over too quickly for you guys? Thank you for asking me a question. Okay, keep them coming. So when we were picking out the study sites for this research, we were trying to have the vegetation be similar both in the right-of-way as well as in the adjacent right-of-way. So in all of these study sites, the adjacent right-of-way habitat is going to be forested. And the other point we were looking for in all these study sites was easy access. So our research teams could actually get in and sample the vegetation and pollinators fairly easily. Okay, so the 3 different treatments that we identified or implemented on our rights of way were different combinations of ways you can apply a chemical and then different chemical formulations. So the first treatment was a high volume broadcast. So in this picture on the right, you can see pretty much everything's been turned brown. So here the entire plot was sprayed and they used a broad spectrum herbicide. So that means whatever that chemical touched, it was going to kill. The second treatment that they tested was what we're calling low volume broadcast. So for this application method, there was someone with a backpack sprayer and they were going out and just targeting, as you can see in these pictures, all these little brown dots. These are little pine trees that had started to germinate and grow in the right-of-way. So you can see here in the background, all these little pine trees, someone walked along and hit them with, again, a broad spectrum herbicide. So whatever the chemical hit the tree, it killed the tree. But you'll also notice a little brown circle below all of these trees. And that's because, again, this is a broad spectrum herbicide. So whatever it touched below the tree, again, it was going to kill. The third treatment we tested was low volume broadcast. So again, they were going along with the backpack sprayer, targeting just the trees again, but this time they were using a grass-friendly herbicide. So it was not supposed to kill the grass. So those are the 3 different treatments that we applied along each of our 4 rights of way. After these IVM treatments were applied, then we went out and sampled pollinators as well as the vegetation to see how the vegetation responded to these different IVM treatments. So for those of you that maybe are not familiar with sampling for bees and pollinators, colored bowl traps is a really common method that is used to sample for pollinators. And in this sampling technique, you basically use 3 different colored bowls, a white, blue, and yellow bowl, and they're filled with soapy water. So it's a passive sampling technique. Insects are attracted to the different colors of bowls, and then they'll get captured in the soapy water. This sampling technique, the bowls, is actually not very effective at collecting bumblebees and honeybees. So this method below, called vein traps, is a more effective method for sampling for those types of bees. And then quadrat sampling was used to go out and sample the vegetation. So where were all of the sampling stations located? Well, we had sampling stations located in the center of the right-of-way, at the edge of the right-of-way, and then in the forested habitat. So at the end of this study, we could compare the effects of the different IVM treatments for vegetation and pollinators, but we could also compare pollinators and vegetation on the right-of-way to off the right-of-way. Okay, I haven't seen any more questions come in the chat box. You guys hit me with some questions. Okay, so for this study, we started the baseline sampling in 2018. So what this means is we went out before the IVM treatments were applied in 2018 to see what the vegetation community and pollinator community looked like before the IVM treatments were applied. So here are some results of what the pollinators looked like. So about 45% of the pollinators were found in the center of the right-of-way, and about another 40% were found at the edge of the right-of-way. And then when we move into the forest, we see that we're finding significantly fewer pollinators, about 16%. When we look at the vegetation, we see that about 50% of the vegetation in 2018 was grass. And then we have about an even split of 25% bare ground to forbs. And then when we go look at some of the pollinators we're finding on the right-of-way, we see about 50% of the pollinators that we're collecting are bees. And here we go. So if we look a little more closely at the different bee groups that we are finding in 2018, So here are our different right-of-ways that we sampled, right-of-way 1 through 4. Blue is representing bees, green beetles, yellow flies, this darker blue butterflies, and then wasps are this green color. So again, you can see the majority of all the sites, most of the pollinators that are being found are bees, followed by beetles and then flies. Overall, we collected a little over 5,000 pollinating insects, and again, bees were about 50% of those, and we identified 30 different bee genera. So now I'm going to transition to talking about 2019 and 2020 data. So in 2019, early in the season, that's when our IVM treatments were actually applied. So over both 2019 and 2020, we have identified 44 different flowering plant species from 20 different families. When we look at the right-of-way composition, so here's like pie charts from 2019 and 2020. Not surprisingly, in 2019, we see an increase in the percentage of dead vegetation, 44%. And that's because that's when we went out and applied those IVM treatments. We see that forbs decreased to about 18% cover, and grasses declined to about 21% cover. If we look at 2020, we see that the dead vegetation is starting to decline. So the vegetation is starting to recover after those IVM treatments were applied. Our forbs have rebounded to about 20%, and our grass has recovered to be about 30% cover. Okay. So now on this slide, I'm going to dive a little more deeply into the vegetation, and I've split 2019 and 2020 data. And we have it separated by treatment, so you can see the results of the treatments a little more closely. So I'm going to remind you that treatment 1 was the treatment where the herbicide was applied to the entire plot, and it was a broad spectrum herbicide. Treatment 2 was where they were doing the spot herbicide applications, but again, it was a broad spectrum herbicide. Treatment 3 was again the spot herbicide applications, but the grass-friendly herbicide, so was not supposed to affect grass. So this pink arrow is showing you where the IVM treatments were applied. So you can see that after the IVM treatments were applied, we see a very large decline, 88% in grass cover. So both of these graphs are showing you grass cover. You see that we see significantly less decline in grass cover for treatments 2 and treatments 3. And treatment 1 remains lower for the most part throughout 2019. When we move to 2020, we begin to see some recovery of that grass, especially in treatment 1. So it has rebounded from about 70% cover to about 40% cover in 2020. And statistically, we're not really seeing any differences between our treatments. But in general, later in the season, we tend to have higher grass cover, again, for treatments 2 and 3, suggesting that those treatments are having a less of effect on grass cover than treatment 1. So now if we look a little closely at what's happening to our forbs, we see a similar result where treatment 1, we see an 84% decline in forbs, but we see less of a decline for treatments 2 and treatments 3. So here again is that pretty large decline for the blue treatment, treatment 1, and we still see some decline for treatments 2 and 3, but it's less. And again, kind of late in the season, we start to see some of those forbs recover. And if we skip to 2020, for treatment 1, certainly the forbs have started to recover early in the season. And another trend we see in the data at this time is in overall treatment 3 tends to have higher forb cover. Now, again, for the most part, it's not statistically significant. You can see on this graph, our error bars are pretty large. So we have a lot of variability in our data, which is causing us not to be able to see or detect any significant treatment differences. Oh, why are the traps set on the eastern edge to the east edge of the right-of-way. I'm thinking that if I understand that question correctly, is it just asking why do we have traps in the center as well as on the edge? Is that the correct answer? Can you maybe chat me a yes or a no?
I think it might be
Yes.
more
Okay.
why is it on the
Okay, so the reason is we wanted to see if there were any edge effects, you know, where at the right-of-way where we have kind of a more grass forb dominated plant community, and then off the right-of-way we have a forested community. So we thought we might be seeing different species there at the edge. So that's why we wanted to put some traps at the edge of the right-of-way. So that's why we have those 3 sampling stations. Are there any other questions for me? This is great. Please ask me questions. Yes. Anne, did you raise your hand or were you just waving?
I typed it in.
Oh, you typed it in. Okay. If management was a broad spectrum, okay, I lost my. If management was, yes, go ahead.
If the power companies were managing by broad spectrum broadcast, like treatment 1, how often would they typically spray on the power line? Like every 3 years or?
Yeah, so most utilities have a 3 to 5 year management cycle. And some companies will even alter, usually they use the same strategy, but there are some companies that will come in and mow like it, you know, in the first year, let's say of the management cycle, and then in year 3, they'll maybe come back and hit it with an herbicide application. So they will stagger mowing and herbicides, but more typically they come in and then do the same, you know, IVM treatment, which oftentimes is either mowing or it's an herbicide application. So in some parts of the country and in some areas, you know, if you're in a, you know, a state park or some areas where herbicide use is restricted, then they'll just be mowing. But usually their management is on a cycle, and it can be anywhere from like a 3-year cycle up to a 5-year cycle. I think I saw another question. This is great, you guys. I was curious why east was favored. Oh, on the transect, I don't know the answer to that question. I think they were just, you know, they were just running their transect off in one direction. And I don't know why they picked east instead of west. It may be partly because of terrain. And in some areas, the terrain kind of dropped off. That's an issue in some of our rights of way. But to be honest with you, on these rights of way, I don't know the answer to that question. Do I have any more questions? You guys are doing great. Thank you. Okay. I think I was done with this slide. Okay, let me scroll back down to the bottom of my chat. Okay. Okay, so to move to the pollinators for this project, in general, as we saw early on, the rights of way are supporting more pollinators than off right of way. So when we look at all the data, 91% of our bees are coming from the right of way as opposed to the adjacent forested habitat. When we dive and look closely at our treatments and how they're affecting pollinators, again, here we have, if you look at the 2019 data, we have our purple arrow that shows you the mean number of bees before treatment and then after treatment. And you'll see we see a significant drop in our bees for July, but across the treatment statistically, there's no treatment differences that we found. And that remains true throughout the rest of the season. All these little A's mean those treatments are not significantly different from each other. When we go look at our 2020 data, again, we see similar numbers of bees in June of 2020 to June of 2019. And then we continue to see a drop off from June to July. And again, no significant treatment differences. So part of this decline that we see in 2019 could be the result of the herbicide applications, The fact that we're seeing it in 2020 also suggests to me there may be some flowering phenology that is also affecting bee abundance on the right-of-way. And in Alabama in July, typically we don't see a lot of flowering. We see flowering earlier in the spring and later in the season. So part of this decline from June and July could also be partly due to just flowering phenology on the right-of-way. And you'll see that late in the season in general, we have really low bee abundances on the right-of-way. I got another question. Let's see. So the answer to that, so the question is, besides mitigating and limiting trees and shrubs, do utilities have any incentives to plant native plants? Are there rules and regulations that vary state by state? And for right-of-ways, the answer to that question is no. What the utilities are doing in terms of trying to, I'm going to tell you at my third project, I'm going to tell you about many utilities are starting to transition from using turf grass seed mixes to native seed mixes when they have the opportunity to plant a new seed mix. But they're not, there's no rules or regulations or incentives to get them to transition to using these native seed mixes. So that's why utilities right now have a lot of questions about cost, because they're nervous about making a switch to a seed mix that will increase their overall costs, both in terms of seeding, the cost of seed, as well as maintenance. So a lot of the research we're doing at EPRI is trying to help them confirm and establish that native seed mixes can establish and be just as effective as putting down a non-native turfgrass mix. Now, I will tell you that's not the case for solar sites, and there are incentives, and there are some states that are incentivizing solar developers to plant native pollinator mixes at solar sites. What are forbs and what is flower phenology? Okay, so a forb is just another word for flower. Oftentimes when we're talking about prairie plant communities, we'll use the term forb. And flower phenology just means the sequence of when flowers bloom throughout the season. So when I said that it could just be that the flowering phenology is lower in July, that just means that naturally we have more flowers blooming in May and June on the right-of-way, different species. But when we get to July, there's less flower species that happen to be blooming at that time in the season. Thank you. You guys, these questions are great. Please keep asking me questions. Okay, so I think I was done with this slide. I keep accidentally messing up my chat box. Okay, so the key findings for this, and I am starting to lose track of time. You'll have to, at 7:30, okay. So the key findings from this project are rights of way support more bees in adjacent forested habitat. Treatment 1 had the largest impact on grasses and forbs, pretty significant declines in both actually, but we did start to see some recovery by 2020, even for that IVM strategy. In general, T3, which is the very targeted grass-friendly herbicide, seem to have less of an effect on the vegetation as well as the forbs. And it also provides a potential benefit to the utility in that, one, they're applying less chemical, and that is also potentially a cost saving. So it's providing environmental benefits in terms of helping protect the grasses and forbs on the right-of-way, but also potentially having a cost benefit for the utility. We did not actually find any significant treatment effects when it came to looking at our pollinators. We have one more year where we're going to be collecting data. In fact, we just finished collecting our May samples. So this will be our final and fourth year of data collection. And then in 2022, we'll be finalizing the study and hopefully publishing the results. So do you guys have any, you've been really good about asking questions as I go along, but before I transition to the next project, any last minute questions on this study? Okay, well, I don't see any coming into the chat box, so I'll go ahead and start talking and telling you a little bit about the next project. So the next project I'm going to share with you is actually in Tennessee, which is where I'm located. For this project, we're working with the Tennessee Valley Authority Southeast Grasslands Initiative, which is a nonprofit that focuses on conserving grasslands in the southeastern part of the United States, and Mississippi State Entomological Museum. And so just to kind of orient you, here is a kind of a map of Tennessee, and you'll see here this yellow color is the Cumberland Plateau. And over here we have a picture of Tennessee, and again we have the Cumberland Plateau highlighted in yellow. Here is Knoxville, where I'm located, and then keep in mind Chattanooga. I'm going to show you guys a map a little later on that highlights Chattanooga, because we are sampling some study sites around Chattanooga this year. So some of you may not have known that the southeastern part of the United States was once covered by about 100 million acres of grassland. And the Cumberland Plateau, this yellow area, was primarily prairie as well as savanna. And most of this prairie and savanna habitat has been lost to forest succession. TVA, which is the utility we're working with for this project, manages about 16,000 miles of transmission lines, or about 240 acres of habitat on rights of way. TVA also uses integrated vegetation management strategies to suppress woody trees and shrubs on their right of way for both reliability of power delivery and also, again, for regulatory rules and reasons. What we're finding is that the results of IVM and suppressing these woody trees and shrubs are actually helping many of these grassland plants persist on rights of way in Tennessee. Here on the left-hand side of this slide are where all the rights of way are in the state of Tennessee, and all these blue dots are mapped occurrences of state and federally listed plant species across the TVA service area. So you can see we have a lot of documented rare plants that are occurring on TVA rights of way. So TVA was interested in learning how compatible their current IVM management practices were with conservation, and how important rights of way were to native plants and pollinators in Tennessee. So here I told you to keep in mind where Chattanooga was located in the state of Tennessee, kind of this very southern part and kind of in the middle. And this year we are sampling we have three rights of way that we're sampling that are a little north of Chattanooga, and then two more rights of way that we are sampling that are southwest of Chattanooga. And this is actually a right-of-way photo I took in 2019 of one of the TVA rights of way and a couple of the orchid species that we observed in 2019 as well. So for this study, we are going out and again sampling plants and sampling pollinators. The study design for this project is over here on the right. On each right-of-way, we're setting up study plots. All the black dots are where we are collecting plant and conducting plant surveys, and all the pink stars are where we are collecting pollinator samples. And again, we're sampling both on the right-of-way as well as in adjacent forested habitat. So here is an actual picture from Google Earth where you can see one of the TVA rights of way. So we're sampling again both on the right of way and then off the right of way in the adjacent forested habitat. The sampling methods we're using for pollinators, again, I'm not going to explain beebles, but we're using beebles again for this project. We're going out and doing sweep netting, which basically means someone standing at a flower patch for a set amount of time, and we're collecting all the pollinators that come into that patch. And then we're also using another sampling technique called malaise traps that just help us collect different types of insects using that sampling technique. So to go over some of the plants results from our rights of way, here along the x-axis, just to kind of orient you, we have our 5 study sites. So I don't know if I mentioned, but in 2019, we sampled 5 right-of-way sites. 2020, we didn't go out and do any sampling because of COVID. And then in 2021, this summer, we're going out and again sampling 5 rights-of-way. Each year, we're sampled a different set of rights-of-way. So the data I'm showing you is results actually from 2019. So here are 5 rights-of-way sites that we sampled in 2019, and we have the blue is the on the right-of-way data, and the green is from the forested plots. And so you can see that average plant richness was 2 times higher on the right-of-way than in the adjacent forested plots. And as I mentioned, TVA is very interested in the ratio of grasses and forbs. So we're wanting to implement IVM treatments that encourage and increase grasses and forbs on the right-of-way and suppress trees and shrubs. So it was very nice to see that there were 6 times more grasses and forbs on the right-of-way than compared to the forested habitat. And when we look at the ratio of grasses and forbs in the forest, it's about a 1-to-1 ratio. This was a really exciting result. One of the rights-of-way that was sampled in 2019, we actually documented 7 different orchid species on this right-of-way. So this is just a pretty picture to show you guys the 7 different orchid species that we did identify on that right-of-way. That right-of-way was a little more wet, kind of a wetter right-of-way where these orchid species were able to persist. So when we move to some of the results for the pollinators on these rights-of-way, if we look at the bee-bowl data, we find that the bee-bowls on the right-of-way caught 16 times more bees than the forested plots, and abundance ranged from 9 to 31 times higher, again, on the right-of-way compared to off right-of-way habitat. When we look at the results from the sweep netting or times collections, we documented 14 times more bees on the right-of-way than an adjacent forested plot. So really demonstrating, again, similar to the Alabama study, the value of the right-of-way habitat and being able to support pollinator species. And this last set of graphs just, again, kind of demonstrates across all of our sampling techniques the fact that both bee richness and abundance was significantly higher on the right-of-way than in the forested plot. So if you look here at the x-axis, we have bee bowls, we have malaise traps, and we have netting. And we have the results for bee species richness, so that's the number of bee species that were collected, and bee abundance, the number of bees that we collected. And you can see for both bee richness and abundance, regardless of sampling technique, the right-of-way was supporting more pollinators than the off right-of-way habitat. We specifically have been counting butterflies as well. And again, both the richness and abundance of butterfly species was 4 times higher on the right-of-way than an adjacent right-of-way plot. And one butterfly, the Leonard skipper, was observed on one right-of-way in Tennessee, and this is actually listed as a vulnerable species in the state of Tennessee. So that's the second project I wanted to tell you guys about. Are there any questions about the study from Tennessee? I haven't seen any, you guys had way more questions for the first project than the second project. Any questions for the Tennessee project? Well, the last project I want to tell you about is a collaboration between AEP and the Dawes Arboretum. And AEP was very interested in opportunities for conservation on their rights-of-way. And as I mentioned earlier, when a utility is building a new right-of-way or when they're doing construction, they have an opportunity to put down a seed mix. And they have a choice between, oh, I see I have some, sorry, I didn't realize I had some animation in this slide. They have a choice between using a cool season non-native grasses or using warm season kind of prairie or pollinator mixes on their rights-of-way. And AEP was very interested in trying to make the transition from using a turf grass mix to a native seed mix. Because as I mentioned before, they had to make a case internally to be able to make that switch from using what they traditionally use as a turf grass mix to a native seed mix. So this project was developed to help them build a case internally for starting to use native seed mixes going forward. So AEP had several questions they were hoping to answer as a result of this project. They had questions about stabilization, and a lot of these questions will help them deal with, again, regulatory permits that they need to close at the end of construction. So they want to know, can stabilization requirements be met within several weeks of seeding? So typically, in order to close their permits, they need to have 70% vegetation cover, and they need their bare ground to remain below 5%. So they're very interested in whether or not a warm season mix can meet these regulatory standards so they could close out their permits after a construction project. The second question they had was around prairie species dominance and if native plants would remain the dominant vegetation cover after 5 years. So they wanted to know, is the seed mix going to germinate and establish, and then will it be competitive in the long term? Next, they had questions about, wildlife utilization, in particular, if pollinators and birds were going to use these flower plots and they were actually going to provide a conservation benefit. And then lastly, they had some questions about the effects of mowing. Could mowing increase plant diversity? And as I mentioned, utilities are always concerned about trees growing in their rights of way, and how can they do a better job managing trees? So could mowing help them do a better job of managing trees early on in a planting? I always like, when I'm talking to utilities, like to remind them of the benefits of native vegetation over a turf grass mix. So in this slide, you can see turf grass all the way over here on the left side of the slide, and you'll notice that the rooting system below ground is not very deep. And when you compare that to the below ground rooting system of a warm season mix, you'll see the roots go very deep. On average, they're 6 to 10 feet deep, and all of this below ground root structure offers several benefits that are really important to utilities. They provide the vegetation drought tolerance, so they don't have to worry about going back and reseeding. They can reduce water runoff. They can decrease soil erosion, which are factors that they're always worried about in construction, and being able to, again, close construction permits. They want to improve the health of the soil. Native plants can improve water infiltration. And once they're established, native plant communities have been shown to increase competition, and they can reduce establishment and invasion of trees, as well as weedy species. And utilities are really interested in this because if they're able to help reduce establishment of trees and weedy species, again, this can help lower their maintenance costs over time. So again, this project was done in Ohio in partnership with AEP and the Dawes Arboretum. So the Dawes Arboretum is where we actually established these research plots. Oh, I got a question. This is great. Okay, let's see what the question is. What is the power transmission industry's interest in this? Trees that reach up towards the power lines? Yes. What height is okay? 1 to 2 meters for most native grasses or forbs, maybe up to 3 meters in spots. Very happy cut plants. Yes. Yes. So, I'm not going to know the actual regulatory standards off the top of my head, but there are actual standards that trees cannot get above a certain threshold or too close to the power lines, and if they do, the utilities will incur daily fines until that tree or hazard tree or vegetation is maintenance is provided to that vegetation to reduce its height. So the regulation is there to help protect the power line and preserve power delivery to homes and businesses. It's particularly important during storms, for example, when you have very tall trees, both in the right-of-way as well as adjacent to the right-of-way that could potentially fall into the power line. So the regulations are there to try to prevent power outages as well as fire risk. So when you have vegetation that's growing up very high, late in the season, and in certain parts of the country, it's also a fire risk. So I don't know the actual standards off the top of my head for, you know, what those rules are, but that's the concern around trees getting too close to the power lines. But low growing vegetation like grasses, our prairie grasses are never going to get tall enough, or cut plants is never going to get tall enough to be an issue in terms of height to the power lines. Did I answer your question? Whoever asked that question, Martha, did I answer your question? If not, I'll be happy to try again. Okay. Okay, I got a thank you. So again, just to kind of go over the goals of this project, the first goal, or first kind of step, we had to actually design a seed mix for this project. And AEP was again interested in the seed mix being economical. So we all know some native prairie seeds are way more expensive than others. So there's some give and take on what species can or should be included in a mix. They wanted it to be effective. Again, they were very concerned about getting early cover and establishment. And then they wanted to have biodiversity benefits. So they did want to have forbs in there that were known to support pollinators and other beneficial insects. We were very interested in establishing and documenting germination, then how the vegetation is established over time. And then, of course, we wanted to document any changes in pollinators and birds to the study plots. So these, at the Dawes Arboretum, we established a total of 6 plots. 3 of these plots were located in an agricultural landscape context. So I don't know if you, here's a power pole right here. So you can kind of see the power line runs here, and then it kind of makes a jog and runs up kind of towards the north. And then 3 additional plots were established in a landscape context of forest. Yes, okay. So I'm just going to kind of quickly go over some photos of the site prep. So as I mentioned, this wasn't an active construction site. So we actually had vegetation on these rights of way. So in the forested plots, we actually had to go in and clear those plots. So we did vegetation removal. Then we actually established the research plots. We actually then went out and hand broadcast the seed mix. And then finally, we covered the site with straw. Oh, do I have another question? Okay, do you have suggestions for property owners that utility companies have right of way as far as planting vegetation to reduce power companies coming in and having to remove trees that may threaten lines? So do you have a right of way that's running through your property? Because you can, many utilities will actually work with you if you're interested in, you know, putting in a native seed mix on the right of way that runs through. Okay, yes. So many utilities will work with you if you're interested in putting in a native seed mix on your right of way. So I don't have any experience with Michigan, whether you are in consumers or DTE area. But I know, for example, I've done a lot of work in Illinois with Ameren, and Ameren and Pheasants Forever work fairly closely together to establish, you know, native habitat when the landowner is interested in doing that. And another another possibility, I don't know if Michigan has any programs, but I know both Alabama and Georgia also have programs through Pheasants Forever and the NRCS to actually put in, again, pollinator habitat on the power line. So in some cases, different organizations will help you pay for the seed to do that habitat establishment. So maybe, I apologize, I don't know what the situation is for Michigan. Okay, so this is what the site looked like in year 1 after the seed mix was established. Year 2, you can see a lot of black-eyed Susans coming in, actually quite nicely. And then year 3, we have seen quite a bit of decline in black-eyed Susan, but we're starting to see other perennials start to come in. The agricultural site didn't require quite as much site prep because it was actually actively being farmed. So, oops, what happened here? I went a little too fast. So this site was actually drilled with the native seed drill. And you can see we have quite a bit of grass in the first year. We start to see some black-eyed Susans coming in year 2. And by year 3, holy cow, we have a lot of partridge pea. So kind of keep this in mind, the progression of some of the annuals when we get to the pollinator data, because I think it might be affecting some of the pollinator data. So for this study, we went out again and sampled the vegetation using quadrat samples. We sampled pollinators using timed transects and timed quadrat sampling. One difference between this study and the previous 2 studies, we are not actually collecting any bees. So all of our pollinator data is visual observation. So it's going to be at a higher level of taxonomic resolution. And then we also went out and did bird count. Do I have another question? Okay, let's see what this one is. We live along a right-of-way in Portage, Michigan. Okay, Portage Northwest Bikeway. Property is owned by Consumers Energy. The line is owned by ITC. They recently came along and clear-cut all woody plants. Next year, they're coming back to spray a defoliant. So is this just part of their routine management, or are they actually thinking of putting in a native seed mix on this right-of-way? Because that would be wonderful. Do you happen to know? I'll keep talking and maybe I'll get an answer to that question. That would be a wonderful project. I would love to have a project. At the end of the presentation, I was going to tell you guys that I haven't been able to find a utility or any organization that's interested in doing an urban project, or an urban right-of-way or a bike path. I think that would be a really great project to be able to put in some pollinator habitat in either an urban setting or along an area where there's a lot of community activity. Okay, so when we look at the results of the vegetation for this study, I know this chart is kind of hard for you guys to look at, but basically I want you to see in the first year, we've got a lot of red. A lot of red means we are not seeing a lot of species germinate, but as we go across the study, we're seeing more and more green. That means we're getting more and more species germinating. In 2017, we actually only had 6 species that germinated, one of which was our cover crop, oats, in addition to species like partridge pea, black-eyed Susan, tall ironweed, and plains coreopsis. In 2018, we actually got 16 species to germinate. 2019, we were up to 20. And then last year, we had 21 of the 24 species that were planted had germinated. The only species that had not germinated were Illinois bundleflower, showy milkweed, and purple prairie clover. Oh, that's disappointing. They refuse to discuss native plants. We're trying to populate with native species, but their arborist refuses to discuss it. Huh. Well, maybe, yes. If you have a contact at Consumers Energy, maybe that's, I would be happy to try to reach out to Consumers Energy to see if they may be open to reconsidering the use of native plants in this section of their right-of-way. It seems like a great opportunity to be able to think about using native plants and putting in a pollinator planting. Sometimes these companies are very large, and there's different people in different groups within a company, and sometimes being able to talk to multiple people in a company is helpful. So if there are any conversations, oh, works for ITC. Okay, so it might be helpful to be able to talk to the utility that is so yes, it may be helpful to have a conversation with the utility. Yep. So if there's an opportunity to have a conversation with you guys and the utility, I'd be happy to try to facilitate that conversation. So when we look at mowing, I think I forgot to mention that each of these 6 research plots that we had, again, there were 3 in the agricultural landscape context and 3 in the forested landscape context. Each of our research plots were cut in half, and half of the plot was mowed and half of the plot was not mowed. So we could look at the effect of mowing on establishment. Not surprisingly, when you go out and mow, you're able to reduce the height of trees. And when you average that for both the agricultural plots and the forested plots, we were able to reduce tree heights by 56%. If you were only to look at the forested plots, we were able to reduce the trees by about 70%. And the trees in the forested plots actually got quite tall. They got up to about 22 feet. So that can go to show you how quickly trees can actually grow on the right-of-way and why utilities are generally concerned about managing for trees as well as shrubs on their rights-of-way. So when you look at this graph, the first 3 plots, 1, 2, and 3, are the agricultural plots. And you can see that we have a lot less trees, not surprisingly, in those plots. Now, when we move over to the 3 forested plots, plots 4, 5, and 6, you can see a lot more trees showing up in these plots. And if you look at the hashed bars are the unmowed plots. And you can see in general for both 2019, which is red, and 2019, which is blue, the unmowed plots are higher than the mowed plots. We are getting close to, we're 8. I am almost done. Thank you, Anne. So really quickly here for the pollinators and birds, you can see the bee groups did increase from 4 to 8. Bee abundance, it kind of goes up and down. So we have about 70 bees in 2017. We go down a little bit to 37 in 2018, and then a huge increase to 120, and then back to 49. And I think some of these bees are responding to some of those annual plants that are coming in and establishing and flowering. The butterfly species hold fairly steady from 11 to 13. Butterfly abundance steadily increases from only 13 butterflies in 2017 all the way up to 85 in 2020. Bird species, again, steadily increased from about 15 in 2017 to about, around 30 to 27 in 2019 and 2020. And bird abundance in general is around 60 in the first 2 years and, around 100, 114 at 99 in 2020. These results in the table are averaged. If we just take counts from across all the plots, we have identified 24 butterfly species, 15 different groups of bees, and 48 bird species. I know these graphs are very busy, but I wanted to show you guys the results of the bee groups. So over here on the right are the different groups of bees that have been identified from these plots. Xylocopa, for example, is carpenter bee. Bombus is your bumblebee. And Apis are your honeybees. And basically what I want you to notice is the very first year after seeding, our plots are dominated basically by 2 bees, bumblebees and honeybees. But by 2020, we're starting to see a really nice increase in bee diversity in our study plots. So basically, if you just look at the colors and the frequencies of the colors, you'll see a really nice increase in pollinator groups. just really quickly, there has been several species of concern observed, a couple of birds, the wood thrush and a warbler, and one butterfly species that's in decline. I'm not sure how this happened. I apologize. There we go. So some key findings for this project really quickly. Native vegetation did establish within 4 weeks. Bare ground was 0.15% by 2018. So the native vegetation established quickly. We had very little bare ground. 21 of the 24 species did establish. Annuals and perennials have been both critical to the establishment process. So having those annuals and like partridge pea and black-eyed Susan come on early have been very important. Those species are now starting to decline as some of the grasses and perennials perennial forbs are starting to increase. We did see that mowing did increase diversity and cover of some of the seeded species. 2 species in particular, butterfly weed and little blue stem, which is a grass, had higher cover in the mowed plots. And again, we saw, not surprisingly, the mowed plots reduce tree height and cover, but not number of trees. Bee visitation was 36% higher in the mowed plot. So again, mowing did help increase bee visitation. And seeded forbs, so those flowers that were in our native seed mix, received about 70% of the bee visits that were observed to flowers. And some of the species that had the highest visitation included black-eyed Susan, partridge pea, lance-leaf coreopsis, cup plant, and gray-headed coneflower. So overall, just to quickly summarize across all of the 3 projects, in general, we find rights-of-way do provide habitat for pollinators. The first 2 studies we saw on right-of-way habitat, the abundance and diversity of bees was much higher than off right-of-way habitat. IVM is helping to support that grass and forb plant community that is supporting these native plants and pollinators on rights-of-way. And rights-of-way, as we just saw in this last project, can successfully establish native seed mixes. At EPRI, I'm very interested in continuing to refine IVM practices, helping utilities think of vegetation management practices that will, again, help lower their costs while also promoting conservation. Developing regionally specific native seed mixes, so different utilities will know what seed mixes and what plants will establish really well on their rights-of-way, and developing best management practices both in the short term as well as in the long term that the utilities can use to help get these native seed mixes established. And just really quickly, I already said this, but I'm always looking for organizations to partner with, to whether that's thinking about establishing native seed mixes on solar sites, at substations, or on rights-of-way. If you guys are interested, I would certainly be more than willing to think about partnering with you on a research project. And I had to show you guys this photo about 30 minutes before this talk. I got these pictures from a collaborator who's out doing vegetation surveys at a solar site. This is another one of my study sites where we seeded a pollinator mix at a solar site. It was seeded about this time last year, and I was just absolutely thrilled when I saw all of these native forb species and flower species in bloom just 1 year after the solar site was seeded. So I hope you enjoy seeing these photos as well. I think there are some, I may have missed some questions in the chat box, and Anne, I don't know if we have time to answer those questions, but thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for all of your questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ashley. No, that was terrific. And I think you did answer all of the questions. I had one about management, but you got to it later about mowing just on your, so I think you got those.
I'll be happy to stay on, no problem.
Yes, that sounds like a great plan. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for joining tonight's event. The program was recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel shortly. I encourage you to visit our program tabs on our website, KalamazooWildOnes.org, for more information on future events. Our group goes on hiatus for the months of June, July, and August. There will be no live programs during these months. We will be featuring online selections of educational videos on our website. Follow us on Facebook for future announcements, and have a great summer.